There are nights when the universe feels too vast, too full of infinite possibilities that stretch like dark water, beyond what any mind can hold. Tonight we begin with a small revelation. Somewhere between a psi and a supernova, a brilliant man learned that the most profound discoveries aren't made in laboratories, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the gentle presence of someone who stays when staying serves no purpose except love. We're here with you, truly. We love you and we care how your heart is doing tonight. You're not alone in this vast, strange cosmos, and sometimes the most extraordinary thing is simply being witnessed by someone who sees your worth without needing to understand your complexity. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Night had a way of softening the hard edges of Dr. Ezra Quantum's laboratory, turning the sharp angles of his interdimensional equipment into gentle curves of shadow and starlight. The blackboards, filled with white constellations of chalk, blurred into a calm dusk of symbols that seemed to breathe with their own quiet rhythm. He moved through this sanctuary of solitude like a careful tide, mindful not to disturb the delicate equilibrium he had built from years of choosing equations over conversations, theories over touch. There was something that had been wrong with the way Ezra dreamed since childhood, though he'd never found words gentle enough to describe it. His dreams weren't the soft, wandering things that most people shared over morning coffee. They were precise, mathematical, filled with formulas that solved themselves while he slept. When he was 7 years old, he had awakened one Tuesday morning with the complete blueprint for interdimensional travel, written in his own small handwriting across his palm, though he wouldn't understand its meaning for another 25 years. His mother had found him that morning, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, staring at the symbols with an intensity that made adults shift uncomfortably. "Did you write this, sweetheart?" she'd asked, kneeling beside him with that careful voice parents use when they're not sure whether to worry or celebrate. Ezra had looked up at her with eyes that seemed too ancient for his small face, and said simply, "I think the numbers wrote themselves." They were lonely. Now, decades later, surrounded by the gentle hum of machines that spoke in frequencies only he could interpret, Ezra understood what his 7-year-old self had intuited. Mathematics wasn't just a language of logic, but a dialect of longing. Every equation he'd ever solved carried within it the weight of connection. Variables seeking their partners, constants yearning for context, formulas that remained incomplete until they found their perfect complement. He paused at his primary workstation, where tonight's experiment waited with patient anticipation. The Lumen Gate, his masterpiece of interdimensional engineering, hummed with the soft contentment of a cat settling into sleep. But as he reached for the activation sequence, his reflection caught in the polished surface of the console, and, for a moment, he saw not the brilliant Dr. Quantum, but simply Ezra, a man who had spent so many years listening to the whispers of other realities that he'd forgotten the sound of his own voice when it wasn't explaining something. "Hello," he said to the empty laboratory, and the word landed like a bird uncertain of its perch. The sound surprised him with its gentleness, and he found himself smiling, not from amusement but recognition. There you are, he thought, not the lecturer or the theorist, just the person. As he made the final calibrations, something shifted. In the quantum field, a flutter barely perceptible like the universe taking a deeper breath. The gate's harmonics wavered, and in that moment of instability, Ezra felt the strangest sensation, as if somewhere across the vast tapestry of realities, another soul was tending to something small and growing, watering seeds in the darkness. With the same careful attention, he applied to nurturing possibilities between worlds. He didn't know as he initiated the sequence that would tear a gentle hole in the fabric of space-time, that he was about to step not just into another dimension, but toward the one person who would teach him that the most elegant solutions often come wrapped in the simplest gestures. The portal shimmered to life, silver as moonlight on water, and as Ezra stepped toward it, he carried with him the weight of every equation he'd ever solved, and the lighter weight of every human connection he'd never quite managed to make. First thing he would notice about the other side was how quiet it was, not the hollow quiet of his laboratory, but the full quiet of a world that was listening to itself breathe. where someone was humming softly to tomatoes in a garden that had never heard of quantum mechanics, but understood perfectly the physics of care, the silver ripple that had carried. Ezra Between Worlds left the faintest shimmer in the air, above a small community garden, like the memory of starlight on still water. In the moments before the portal fully opened, the evening seemed to hold its breath, waiting with the patient attention of someone who understands that the most important arrivals often come quietly, without fanfare or warning bells. Gerald Vale, Jerry. To everyone who had ever shared a conversation longer than the time it takes to comment on the weather, moved through his garden with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that rushing never helped anything grow faster. The tomato plants received his attention first, each one greeted with a gentle murmur as he checked their progress. "Looking strong today," he told a particularly ambitious beefsteak variety, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had never felt foolish talking to living things that couldn't talk back. Jerry possessed the rare gift of noticing, not just the obvious things that demanded attention, but the subtle details that most people walked past without seeing. He knew that Mrs. Chen from apartment 3B always paused to smell the roses on her way to work, so he made sure to plant them along her usual path. He remembered that the elderly man who fed pigeons in the courtyard had mentioned missing the lavender from his childhood garden, so Jerry had quietly added a patch near the bench where he liked to sit. These weren't grand gestures or calculated kindnesses. They were simply the natural overflow of a heart that had learned to pay attention to the small ways people revealed what brought them comfort. Tonight, as twilight painted the sky in gentle watercolors, Jerry found himself making his usual rounds with an extra sandwich wrapped in wax paper tucked into his jacket pocket. He couldn't have explained why. It wasn't as if he was expecting company. But something in the quality of the evening air suggested that someone, somewhere, might find themselves unexpectedly hungry and far from home. His grandmother had always made extra food, just in case, and Jerry had inherited both her recipe for kindness and her intuition that the universe occasionally sent people who needed feeding. The herbs came next in his evening ritual. Basil, that released its perfume at the gentlest touch, mint that had learned to behave itself after years of patient boundary setting, and rosemary that pretended to be self-sufficient but still leaned toward his voice when he spoke to it. "You're all doing beautiful work," he murmured, adjusting a support stake here, brushing away an aphid there. His movements carried the confidence of someone who understood that care was not about control, but about creating conditions where things could flourish in their own time and their own way. As he straightened up, brushing soil from his hands, with the satisfaction of another day's tending complete, the air above the marigold patch began to shimmer with an almost imperceptible light. Jerry paused, his head tilted with the curious attention of someone who had learned to trust his instincts about when the world was trying to tell him something. The light wasn't harsh or alarming. It pulsed with the gentle rhythm of a heartbeat. Silver and soft as moonlight on water. He didn't step back or call out in alarm. Instead, Jerry reached into his pocket and pulled out the extra sandwich, unwrapping it with the calm deliberation of someone who had always believed that the best response to the unexpected was usually the simplest one. Be ready to help and trust that kindness would find its proper destination. The portal opened like a door made of starlight, and through it tumbled not an invader or a threat, but simply a person who looked like he'd had a very long day and could probably use a friend. Jerry caught him as he fell, cushioning his landing with steady arms and the kind of presence that made strangers feel safe enough to rest. "Well," Jerry said softly to the unconscious figure now cradled among his marigolds, "looks like someone's having quite an adventure. Good thing we made that extra sandwich. The weight of another person carried carefully is always lighter than expected when lifted with purpose rather than urgency." Jerry gathered the unconscious stranger with the same gentle attention he gave to transplanting seedlings, mindful of fragile roots and tender growth points that might not be immediately visible. The man's clothes told a story of brilliant distraction. A lab coat that had seen better decades layered over a sweater faded to the color of tired thoughts, and strange boots that seemed to have walked through starlight itself. As Jerry lifted him, he noticed the details that spoke of a life lived entirely inside one's own head. fingertips stained with chalk, and something that shimmered like interdimensional residue. Hair that stood at angles, suggesting frequent encounters, with electrical fields, and a small device no larger than a deck of cards that pulsed gently at his wrist, as if remembering a song it hadn't quite finished playing. The journey from garden to apartment was brief, but felt significant, like crossing a threshold between worlds that had nothing to do with dimensional physics and everything to do with the simple act of choosing to help. Jerry's home welcomed them with the quiet grace of a place arranged by someone who understood that comfort was built from small, thoughtful details rather than expensive furniture. Plants occupied every surface in the natural way of someone who enjoyed sharing space with growing things, and books were scattered about, gardening manuals mixed with poetry, cookbooks bookmarked with pressed flowers. Jerry settled the stranger onto his couch, covering him with the quilt his grandmother had made from fabric scraps that told 3 generations of family stories. The pattern was chaotic, but somehow harmonious, like a visual representation of how love could make sense out of seemingly random pieces. He adjusted the pillow beneath the man's head, noting how even in unconsciousness, his brow remained slightly furrowed, as if his mind continued wrestling with equations that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. In the kitchen, Jerry moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who found meditation in simple tasks. He put the kettle on for chamomile tea with honey, the kind that tasted like being cared for, and began preparing soup with ingredients that had been waiting patiently in his refrigerator for exactly this sort of unexpected need. The gentle clatter of pots and soft bubbling created a domestic lullaby against the city's distant hum. He arranged the sandwich on his grandmother's chipped ceramic plate, the one that was warm and comforting in the hands, despite its imperfections. Turkey and Swiss on bread he'd baked that morning, cut diagonally, because somehow diagonal sandwiches always seemed more optimistic than rectangular ones. He set everything on a tray with the unconscious artistry of someone who believed presentation was just another way of saying, "You matter." Returning to the living room, Jerry settled into his armchair, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to avoid overwhelming someone who would clearly wake up confused. He didn't read or pace or fuss. He simply waited with the patient presence of someone who understood that some things needed time and gentle space to unfold. As dawn painted the sky a faint rose, the stranger began to stir. His eyelids fluttered with the delicate movement of someone surfacing from very deep water, and when they opened, they revealed irises the color of storm clouds shot through with silver lightning. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling with the bewildered expression of someone trying to remember which reality he'd landed in. Then his gaze found Jerry's face, and something shifted from analytical to vulnerable. His first conscious thought wasn't about dimensional coordinates or quantum mechanics, but something softer and more immediate. Someone had covered him with a blanket that smelled like lavender. "Take your time," Jerry said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used with struggling plants. "You're safe here. You fell into my marigolds. They're tougher than they look." The stranger's hand moved instinctively toward the device at his wrist, checking it the way some people check a pulse. When it glowed reassuringly under his fingers, he seemed to relax a fraction. "I'm Ezra," he said, his voice hoarse from dimensional travel and what sounded like years of forgetting to drink enough water. "Hi, Ezra," Jerry replied, and the name settled neatly into the space between them, like a seed finding good soil. "There's tea and soup when you're ready, and I made an extra sandwich because I had a feeling someone might need it tonight." The word sandwich settled into Ezra's consciousness like a small revelation wrapped in wax paper. He sat up slowly, testing the reality of someone who had prepared food for a stranger who hadn't yet arrived, based on nothing more than the gentle intuition that someone, somewhere, might need feeding. In all his travels across dimensions where mathematics took physical form and time flowed in spirals, this simple act of foresight felt like the most elegant equation he'd ever encountered. "You made it before you knew I was coming," Ezra said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a new law of physics. The tea warmed his hands, chamomile with honey that tasted like being expected, like being hoped for. Jerry settled back into his chair with the comfortable ease of someone who had never questioned the logic of preparing for kindness. "Sometimes you get a feeling," he said simply, "like when the tomatoes need water even though rain's coming. They might need the attention more than the moisture." This explanation should have been insufficient for a mind that operated in precise measurements and provable theorems. Instead, Ezra found himself nodding with recognition that bypassed his intellect entirely. There were forms of intelligence that had nothing to do with accumulated knowledge and everything to do with accumulated compassion, a different kind of genius that measured success in comfort given rather than problems solved. He reached for the sandwich, cut diagonally because diagonal somehow felt more optimistic than rectangular. The first bite grounded him in ways that dimensional anchors never could. Turkey and Swiss and mustard, applied with the precision of someone who understood that care lived in the details. "This is extraordinary," he said, meaning it in ways that had nothing to do with molecular composition and everything to do with being nourished by intention. "It's just a sandwich," Jerry replied, but his voice carried quiet satisfaction, the contentment of someone who had learned that just was often where the most important things lived. Ezra felt the familiar urge to explain, to repay kindness with knowledge. "I work with frequencies," he offered gently. "Every reality vibrates at its own pitch. If you listen carefully enough, you can tune doorways between them. It's like finding the key that makes a room open to another room." "Does it hurt when you listen that hard?" Jerry asked, and the question landed somewhere tender that Ezra hadn't known existed. He paused, considering honesty over expertise. "Sometimes, like thinking pulls too tight behind my eyes." "Then we'll go slow," Jerry said, as if this settled the matter entirely. "Have you eaten today?" The question was so simple, so fundamentally caring, that Ezra felt something shift in his chest. When had anyone last asked him about anything so basic, without expecting him to transform it into a theorem? "I forget sometimes," he admitted, "when the equations get interesting." Jerry's smile was warm and knowing. "The best discoveries happen when you're taking care of yourself too. Hard to think clearly on an empty stomach, no matter how many dimensions you've been through." As Ezra finished the sandwich, he realized he was truly tasting food for the first time in years, not consuming fuel for thought, but experiencing nourishment prepared with attention. The device at his wrist pulsed gently, reminding him that other realities waited, but for now he was content to exist in this one, where someone made extra sandwiches and asked gentle questions about whether thinking hurt. The last crumb of sandwich dissolved on Ezra's tongue, but its warmth lingered in places deeper than his stomach, settling into the quiet, dusty corners of himself that had grown accustomed to subsisting on equations alone. He sat with the empty plate in his lap, reluctant to signal that this unexpected sanctuary might be temporary, watching Jerry move through his evening routine with the same unhurried attention he'd given to the garden. There was something profound happening here, Ezra realized, something that defied his usual frameworks for understanding the world. "Let me make you one," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the impulse. "My turn." Jerry's eyebrows lifted in pleased curiosity, the same expression he might wear watching a seedling push through soil. "We can do that. Kitchen's yours." In the small kitchen, Ezra lined up slices of bread with the precision of aligning interdimensional coordinates, but his hands trembled slightly, not from dimensional travel, but from the unfamiliar territory of reciprocal care. He measured mustard with the edge of a knife, wanting the swipe to be perfect, then paused halfway through and glanced at Jerry with the vulnerable uncertainty of someone learning a new language. "How much?" he asked. Jerry came to stand beside him, warmth at his elbow like a gentle gravitational field. "Until it tastes like someone thought about you while they spread it," he said, handing Ezra a small sprig of basil. "Tuck this under the cheese. It makes everything remember summer." Ezra breathed in the green, peppery scent and did exactly as told, understanding for the first time that following instructions could be its own form of intimacy. He cut diagonally, because diagonal somehow felt more optimistic than rectangular, and when he handed the plate to Jerry, his heart tugged with the unfamiliar pleasure of having made something not to solve a problem, but to offer care. They ate by the window as morning pressed its palm against the glass. Jerry took a thoughtful bite and nodded approval. "You listen well," he said. "I'm learning to," Ezra answered, realizing that listening could be done with hands, with the placement of basil, with attention paid to another person's preferences. "The portal device," Ezra said eventually, touching the gentle pulse at his wrist. "It's designed to open again in 12 hours. A safety protocol." He paused, realizing he was explaining not to educate, but to apologize for the disruption, for the strangeness, for the way his presence had complicated Jerry's peaceful evening. "You're not curious about where I came from?" Ezra asked, genuinely puzzled by this absence of interrogation. Jerry considered this with the thoughtful pause of someone who chose words like seeds. "I figure you'll tell me what you want me to know. Though I am curious about whether you've got people who worry about you when you're traveling." "Not really," Ezra admitted, the words carrying more weight than intended. "My work is solitary." "That sounds lonely," Jerry said simply, without pity or judgment. "It is," Ezra replied, surprised by his own honesty. "But I'm good at equations. People are more complicated." "People are just different kinds of equations," Jerry said, settling deeper into his chair. "They just use variables like kindness and time instead of numbers. Still solvable, though. Just takes different tools." The device at his wrist pulsed once, a gentle reminder that doorways would open, that other realities waited. But alongside the familiar pull of curiosity, a quieter force gathered, subtle as tide under moon. In the space of a sandwich, a pattern had begun, one that didn't demand, only invited. "I usually make lunch for 2, Jerry mentioned casually. "Habit." Ezra touched the napkin in his pocket where he'd sketched his equation of care, and felt something, a line that had nothing to do with dimensional coordinates and everything to do with choosing to stay where someone thought about you while spreading mustard. The morning unfolded with the gentle rhythm of 2 people learning to share space without crowding it. Ezra found himself drawn to small tasks, rinsing dishes with the same careful attention he usually reserved for calibrating equipment, folding the quilt that had served as his refuge, following Jerry into the garden where the tomatoes hung heavy with summer's patient work. "These little shoots," Jerry said, guiding Ezra's fingers to the green growth between stem and branch. "They're called suckers, not because they're bad, they just take energy from where it's needed most." The lesson settled into Ezra's mind, like a gentle equation, one that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with understanding where to direct attention for the best growth. The device at his wrist began its countdown with increasing insistence, each pulse a reminder that doorways waited, that other dimensions beckoned with their unsolved mysteries. Ezra felt the familiar pull of curiosity, but it competed now with something quieter and more complex. The gravitational field of being somewhere he was expected, where someone made lunch for 2 out of habit rather than obligation. As afternoon light slanted through the garden, painting everything gold and drowsy, Ezra watched Jerry tend to a root-bound fern with infinite patience. "Sometimes they just need more room to stretch," Jerry murmured, gently loosening the tangled roots. "Growth can feel uncomfortable when you're used to being contained." The parallel wasn't lost on Ezra, who had spent years contained within the brilliant boundaries of his own isolation. He thought of his laboratory, sterile, silent, echoing, with the sound of equations that no one else would ever hear. He thought of breakthroughs celebrated alone, of discoveries that meant everything and nothing because they existed in a vacuum of solitude. "I could stay," he said quietly, the words surprising him with their certainty. "The portal can be recalibrated." Jerry's hands paused in their work, soil crumbling between his fingers, like the moment before a decision takes shape. "The tomatoes are coming in well this year," he said simply. "Someone should be around to help harvest them. They don't like to be picked by strangers." The device pulsed urgently now, the portal shimmering to life above the marigolds like moonlight remembering where to land. Ezra looked at the familiar silver doorway, then at the man who talked to plants like old friends, who made sandwiches, based on intuition, who asked whether thinking hurt too much. He reached for the device and pressed the recalibration sequence, watching the urgent pulse gentle into patient waiting. The portal would endure, the equations would keep. But this choice to stay where someone thought about him while spreading mustard felt like the most elegant solution he'd ever discovered. "I'll be here for the harvest," Ezra said, settling beside Jerry on the garden step. In the soft evening air, surrounded by the quiet mathematics of growing things, he felt something align that had nothing to do with dimensional coordinates and everything to do with choosing connection over solitude, presence over possibility. The tomatoes would be ready soon, and for the first time in years, Ezra would be there to help gather what patience and care had grown. The days that followed Ezra's choice to stay unfolded with the gentle precision of equations learning to breathe. A rhythm emerged so naturally it felt like remembering rather than discovering. Mornings began with the soft shuffle of Jerry checking tomatoes, while Ezra set his notebook beside the coffee cups, sketching constellations in margins that had never before held anything more complex than grocery lists. He found himself speaking differently here, placing words like careful stepping stones across the stream between his brilliant isolation and Jerry's patient curiosity. When Ezra described the frequencies that sang between dimensions, Jerry tilted, his head with the same attention he gave to plants that needed listening to. "So every place has its own heartbeat," Jerry said, testing the idea the way you test fruit for ripeness, "and you're learning to hear the music." The comparison delighted Ezra in ways he couldn't quantify. No one had ever called his work musical before, but now he could hear the symphony hidden in his equations, variables harmonizing like instruments, finding their key, solutions resolving with the satisfaction of chords coming home. "I forget to listen for my own rhythm sometimes," Ezra admitted one afternoon, watching Jerry trim basil with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that care lived in the details. "Then maybe start there," Jerry said simply. "Find your own song first. The equations can learn to dance with it once it's steady." In the evenings, Ezra began the delicate work of translating his inner cosmos into language that didn't require degrees to appreciate. He spoke of cosmic background radiation not as scientific data, but as the universe's oldest lullaby, still humming after billions of years. When he described quantum entanglement, Jerry's eyes brightened with recognition. "Like when you know someone's thinking of you even when they're far away," Jerry said, and Ezra felt something shift, not in his understanding of physics, but in his understanding of wonder. He wasn't explaining anymore. He was sharing the quiet awe that had always lived at the heart of his discoveries. The device at his wrist began responding differently too, its hum gentling when Jerry was near, steadying further when Jerry spoke. To the plants in that voice that made growing things lean toward him. Ezra logged the observation out of habit, but what he wrote surprised him. Resonance improves in the presence of attention. One evening, as twilight painted the garden in watercolors, Ezra looked up from his notes to find Jerry watching him with that steady, unafraid expression that made complicated things feel welcome. "I'd like to show you something," Ezra said, his voice carrying the tentative hope of someone offering their most treasured secret. Not to travel anywhere, just to look through a doorway, see what other heartbeats sound like. Jerry's smile was warm as summer soil. "I'd like that very much." For the first time in years, Ezra wanted to share a discovery not to prove his brilliance, but to give someone else the gift of wonder he'd found hidden in the mathematics of connection. The evening air held its breath. As Ezra made the gentle adjustments to his device, the soft hum rising like a contented sigh from deep within the garden's heart. They remained among the tomatoes and marigolds. This felt truer than any sterile laboratory, more honest than walls that had never learned to listen to growing things. "We'll just open a window," Ezra murmured, his fingers dancing across the device with the same careful attention Jerry gave to transplanting seedlings. Like looking through glass into a neighbor's yard, except the neighbor lives in a different key entirely. The portal shimmered to life between two trellises where morning glories waited patiently for dawn. But instead of the harsh silver of interdimensional travel, this doorway glowed with the soft luminescence of moonlight on still water, a viewing glass rather than a passage, an invitation to witness rather than intrude. Through the gentle frame, a meadow stretched beneath a lavender sky, and the first sound that reached them wasn't dramatic or alien, but achingly familiar, the kind of lullaby that lives in the space between a mother's heartbeat and a child's dreams. Every flower in the distant field swayed not to wind, but to melodies they sang to themselves, each blossom carrying its own note in a harmony that had been building since the first seed learned to sprout. Jerry stepped closer, with the quiet fascination of someone discovering that the universe was even more beautiful than he'd dared imagine. "They're singing," he whispered, his voice carrying the reverence of witnessing something sacred. "Every living thing has its frequency," Ezra explained softly, but found himself listening not as a scientist cataloguing phenomena, but as someone finally hearing the music he'd been measuring for years. "I never thought to just listen to them as songs." A particularly bold sunflower near the portal's edge turned toward them, its golden face tilting with curiosity, and offered a note so pure and welcoming that both men found themselves smiling without conscious decision. The melody carried summer, afternoons and the deep contentment of roots in good soil. "It's saying hello," Jerry said with absolute certainty, raising his hand in a gentle wave. The sunflower's song brightened, joined by nearby blooms creating harmony that sounded like laughter translated into petals and stems. Together they leaned slightly toward the threshold, not crossing, but close enough to feel the meadow's patient rhythm against their skin like a warm blanket. A single petal detached and drifted toward them on currents so delicate, Ezra felt them as whispers against his forearms. When it touched Jerry's outstretched palm, the petal hummed 3 gentle notes, as if offering its name. "For your journal," Ezra suggested quietly, watching Jerry cup the singing petal with the same tenderness he showed struggling seedlings. As they drew back, the portal gentled to a comfortable glow, present but undemanding, like a window left open to let in night. "Air!" The flower's lullaby faded to the distance of neighbors humming 2 gardens over, but something had shifted between them, a recognition that wonder shared was wonder multiplied, that the universe's most beautiful secrets revealed themselves not to brilliant minds working alone, but to hearts brave enough to listen together. The singing petal's 3-note lullaby had settled into the evening air like a gentle benediction, and as they sat together on the garden step, Ezra found himself studying the way wonder had transformed Jerry's face into something luminous and peaceful. The portal maintained its soft glow between the morning glory trellises, patient as moonlight. "Waiting. I want to show you something that might be harder to watch," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone offering a difficult gift. "Other versions of myself. The paths I didn't take." Jerry's expression remained steady, curious without being demanding. "We can look," he said simply. "We don't have to stay long." With gentle adjustments to the device, the singing meadow faded, like a dream upon waking, replaced by the harsh fluorescent brightness of a laboratory that could have been Ezra's if loneliness had been allowed to finish its architectural work. Everything gleamed with sterile perfection. No dust, no plants, no second chair. Equations climbed the walls like ivy that had forgotten when to stop growing, and in the center, a figure who wore Ezra's bone structure but not his softness moved, between consoles with mechanical precision. This alternate Ezra paused at a workstation where a single singing flower, identical to the one that had gifted them its petal, hung suspended in a shimmering containment field. But instead of listening to its lullaby, he was dissecting it, reducing its 3-note song to oscillating waveforms on a screen, cataloging frequencies with the detached efficiency of someone who had forgotten that some truths could only be experienced, never explained. "He's trying to solve the song instead of hearing it," Jerry observed gently, and Ezra felt the profound sadness of recognition settle in his chest. The portal shifted again, revealing another reality where a different version of himself stood alone in a vast space, filled with holographic displays of cosmic data. This Ezra was older, his hair wilder, his posture suggesting a life lived in constant intellectual battle. He was brilliant, undoubtedly, arguing with projections of theoretical constructs that bent space-time around his words. But his hands trembled with isolation, and his eyes held the hollow brightness of someone who had won every argument except the one that mattered most, the quiet conversation with another soul about whether thinking hurt too much. "I could have been either of them," Ezra said softly, watching these mirrors of unlived lives. All that knowledge, all those discoveries, and no one to share the wonder with. No one to remind me that equations are just another way of listening to the universe's heartbeat. Jerry's hand found his sleeve, a touch that said more than analysis ever could. "But you're not them," he said with quiet certainty. "You chose to stay for the tomato harvest. You chose to make sandwiches and ask about singing flowers." As the portal gently closed, folding back into the device like a sigh finding its rest, Ezra understood that the most elegant solution wasn't always the most complex one. Sometimes it was as simple as choosing connection over isolation, presence over possibility, the soft gravity of someone who made lunch for two even when they lived alone. "Tomorrow," Ezra said, settling deeper into the evening's embrace, "I'll show you the dimension where patience grows like trees. And I'll bring better sandwiches for the journey," Jerry replied. And they sat together as the first stars appeared, carrying the weight of paths not taken and the lighter weight of paths chosen with care. The promise of better sandwiches lingered in the morning air like a gentle covenant as Jerry moved through his kitchen with the thoughtful precision of someone preparing provisions for a sacred journey. The wax paper crinkled with the soft music of care being taken as he wrapped turkey and Swiss with deliberate attention, adding sprigs of basil between layers because he'd learned that some flavors were actually forms of memory made edible. Ezra watched from the doorway, his device humming with patient readiness at his wrist, but found himself more captivated by the way Jerry folded napkins with the same gentle attention most people reserved for prayer. "You're preparing, like we're going somewhere important," Ezra observed, his voice carrying the wonder of someone still learning that ordinary acts could be ceremonies. "Aren't we?" Jerry replied, meeting his eyes with that steady warmth that made complicated things feel welcome. "Any place you want to share feels important to me." The dimension of patience trees revealed itself through the portal like a secret garden opening to trusted visitors. Ancient oaks stretched toward a sky the color of deep meditation, their branches moving not with wind, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of centuries learning to breathe. Each tree wore time like comfortable clothing, unhurried, unworried, content to exist in the space between moments where wisdom grew like rings in heartwood. They stepped through together, and immediately Ezra felt his usual urgency dissolve like sugar in warm tea. The air itself seemed to encourage slowing down, breathing deeper, allowing thoughts to settle like sediment in still water. Jerry moved toward the nearest tree with the recognition of someone meeting a kindred spirit, placing his palm against bark that felt warm and welcoming as sun-heated stone. "They're not just patient," Jerry said softly, his voice carrying wonder without surprise. "They're teaching patience, like the feeling is growing here, spreading through the roots." Ezra leaned against a neighboring trunk and felt the tree's ancient contentment seep into his bones, like warmth from a perfect fire. For the first time in decades, his mind wasn't racing toward the next discovery, the next breakthrough, the next proof of his worth through intellectual achievement. Instead, he simply existed in the space between heartbeats, breathing in rhythm with beings that had learned the profound art of taking time. "I never stay anywhere long enough to feel this," he admitted, watching Jerry settle cross-legged at the base of a particularly wise-looking maple whose bark held the silver patterns of countless seasons. "I'm always moving toward the next question, the next mystery. Maybe that's why you needed to find someone who knows how to stay still," Jerry said, unwrapping their lunch with unhurried hands. "Someone who can teach you that answers don't always come from searching. Sometimes they come from sitting quietly until they're ready to visit." They ate their sandwiches in the cathedral quiet of the Patience Grove, tasting not just turkey and Swiss, but the flavor of time taken, attention given, presence shared. The trees around them swayed in their ancient rhythm, and Ezra felt something. Fundamental shift, not in his understanding of physics, but in his comprehension of what it meant to be fully present in a single moment, anchored by the gentle gravity of someone who chose, again and again, to stay. The patience trees had left their gift in Ezra's bones, a deep stillness that followed them back through the portal like a benediction carried in cupped hands. For days afterward, he found himself approaching his work differently, allowing questions to sit and ripen rather than chasing immediate answers. He even began humming the three-note lullaby of the singing flower as he made his morning coffee, the melody weaving itself through equations like a gentle thread connecting mathematics to wonder. But the universe, even in its most generous moments, has a way of teaching that growth often comes paired with gentle tests of what we've learned. The morning arrived soft and golden, with Jerry tending to the tomatoes that had grown heavy with summer's patient work, when two pieces of news found their way into the peaceful rhythm they had built. Ezra discovered it first, a small miscalculation in his resonance equations, the kind of error that whispers rather than shouts but unravels weeks of careful work nonetheless. The device at his wrist had been humming contentedly all week, steady as a cat's purr, but now it wavered with uncertainty, losing the gentle harmony it had found in Jerry's presence. The recorded lullaby from the singing flower, their first shared wonder, flickered and dissolved into static, becoming unretrievable as morning mist. At nearly the same moment, Jerry found the letter that had been slipped under his door sometime in the night. Official letterhead, formal language, 30 days' notice that the community garden would be sold to developers. The tomatoes hanging heavy on their vines, Mrs. Chen's roses, the lavender patch where the elderly gentleman fed pigeons, all of it scheduled to become memory by autumn's end. They sat together at the kitchen table, each holding their own piece of unwelcome news, and for a moment the apartment felt too small to contain both disappointments. Ezra stared at his silent device, while Jerry smoothed the edges of the letter with hands that trembled only slightly. "I keep thinking about the plants," Jerry said quietly. "They don't know they're about to become homeless." "And I keep thinking about that flower's song," Ezra replied, his voice carrying the particular sadness of someone who had learned to treasure small wonders only to watch them slip away. "I never made a backup recording. I was so sure some things were safe once you'd heard them." The familiar tightening began behind Ezra's eyes, the old, cold dread of not being enough, of failing at the very moment when success mattered most. His first instinct, honed by decades of solitary struggle, was to retreat into work, to solve his way out of disappointment through sheer intellectual force. Instead, he found himself looking at Jerry, who was studying the letter with the same careful attention he gave to plants that needed extra care. "Does it pull too tight?" Jerry asked gently, recognizing the signs of a brilliant mind turning against itself. Ezra nodded, and the first tear arrived so quietly he might not have noticed, if the room hadn't already been listening. "I've always been afraid that if I stop being remarkable, I'll disappear," he whispered. "That if I lose something I discovered, the universe will take the rest back." Jerry reached across the table, not to touch, but to push the morning's forgotten coffee closer, the gesture carrying all the comfort of being seen without judgment. "Sometimes a branch snaps in a good storm," he said softly. "The tree learns a new shape. It doesn't forget how to grow." They sat in the gentle weight of shared disappointment, letting it settle like sediment in still water rather than fighting its presence. Outside, the tomatoes continued their patient ripening, and somewhere in the space between loss and possibility, a new question began to take shape. "What if we could take it with us?" Ezra said eventually, the words surprising him with their certainty. "Not just the plants, but the whole garden. Find it a place where 30 days could become 30 years. Jerry's eyes lifted with the cautious hope of someone who had learned not to expect miracles, but hadn't quite given up believing in them. "Is that possible?" "I don't know," Ezra admitted, feeling the familiar thrill of a problem that demanded not just intelligence but imagination, not just knowledge but care. "But I think it might be the most important equation I've ever tried to solve." The device at his wrist pulsed gently, responding to the shift from despair to purpose, and Ezra realized that some solutions couldn't be found in isolation. They required the patient wisdom of trees, the steady presence of someone who knew how to tend growing things, and the strange mathematics of two hearts choosing to face uncertainty together. The morning after their shared resolve brought a different quality to the light filtering through Jerry's kitchen window. Not just illumination, but invitation. They sat at the small table that had become their command center, surrounded by the gentle archaeology of their friendship. Coffee cups worn smooth by daily use, Jerry's gardening journals now margin-decorated with Ezra's flowing equations, and the patient hum of possibility settling into the spaces between their words. Ezra worked differently now, his calculations infused with what he had begun calling comfort frequencies, the particular resonance of soil that remembered being tended by caring hands, the specific vibration of roses that had learned to lean toward Mrs. Chen's morning greetings. Each variable in his dimensional translocation formula carried not just mathematical weight, but emotional DNA, the invisible connections that made a place feel like home rather than simply location. "I keep thinking about what you said," Ezra murmured, sketching symbols that curved like vine tendrils around the margins of seed catalogues. "About folding space the way you fold a napkin, no creases sharp enough to bruise roots." His device pulsed gently as it scanned dimensional frequencies, searching for something that felt less like conquest and more like invitation. The breakthrough came as a whisper rather than a shout, a harmonic so delicate that Ezra almost dismissed it as background static. But something in its gentle persistence drew him deeper, the way Jerry was drawn to plants that needed extra listening. "Here," he said softly, his voice carrying the reverence of someone discovering a secret the universe had been keeping safe. A reality where smallness isn't limitation, it's perfection. The portal opened like a door made of morning light, revealing a world where everything existed in exquisite miniature. Trees rose no taller than teacups, their leaves perfectly formed, each vein a tiny miracle of engineering. Rivers flowed like silver threads across landscapes of moss that felt like the softest carpet, and creatures no larger than dewdrops moved with the unhurried grace of beings who had never learned to doubt their own significance. Jerry's gasp was pure delight as he knelt beside the threshold, watching a herd of deer smaller than ladybugs graze in clover that released microscopic puffs of fragrance. "They're so completely themselves," he whispered, his eyes bright with wonder. "Even tiny. They know exactly how to be deer." Together they stepped through and immediately felt the world's teaching settle into their bones. Here precision wasn't about control, but about reverence. Every footstep required the kind of attention Jerry gave to transplanting seedlings. Every breath needed to be gentle enough not to disturb the delicate choreography of life happening. Chat thumbnail scale. At the base of a tree no higher than Ezra's palm, they found what they hadn't known they were seeking. A seed pod shaped like cupped hands, humming with the frequency of shelter rather than containment. When Jerry lifted it, waiting patiently for the tiny tree to release it willingly, the pod settled into his palms with weight that was more than physical, carrying the promise of spaces that could hold without harming. "A carrying seed," Ezra interpreted, his device translating the pod's gentle resonance. "It doesn't trap or compress. It remembers the shape of home and keeps it safe until it's time to unfold again." They returned through the portal carrying more than a solution. They carried the understanding that some problems required not force but finesse, not conquest, but collaboration with the quiet wisdom of small things that knew how to hold the world gently in their tiny, perfect hands. The carrying seed had found its place in their daily rhythm, like a gentle heartbeat, settling into sync with their own. 3 mornings had passed since their return from the miniature world, and each day the pod's warmth grew more responsive to their presence, pulsing with the patient contentment of something learning to trust the hands that held it. Ezra found himself checking on it between calculations, watching its surface shimmer, with patterns that reminded him of fingerprints made of starlight. "It's learning our frequency," he explained softly as they sat together at the kitchen table, morning light painting everything gold and possible. Like tuning to a radio station that plays the music of home. Jerry reached out with one gentle finger, and the seed's glow deepened to the warm amber of late afternoon sunshine. "It feels like it's listening," he said with quiet certainty. "Like it wants to understand what we're trying to save." Together, they began mapping the garden's true geography, not just the physical dimensions, but the emotional coordinates that made it irreplaceable. Ezra's notebooks filled with equations that curved like vine tendrils, mathematical expressions for the way Mrs. Chen's roses leaned toward her morning greetings, the precise frequency of contentment that hummed around the bench where the elderly gentleman fed pigeons. Star charts aren't just for the sky, Ezra said, sketching gentle spirals that looked more like growth patterns than geometric proofs. They're maps of trust. This curve here, it's the path Mrs. Chen walks when she visits. Her roses. And this cluster represents where the pigeons gather, the accumulated kindness of years of shared mornings. Jerry leaned closer, delighted recognition brightening his face. That swoop there looks like the tomato ladle, he said, pointing to a constellation Ezra hadn't named. See how it scoops up the afternoon sun and pours it right where the heavy fruit needs it most? The insight made Ezra laugh softly, a sound like air he hadn't known he'd been holding, finally finding release. He added a careful note. Transfer curve enhanced by afternoon kindness. Teaching felt different now, less like instruction, more like translation of a shared love into language both their hearts could read. As they worked, something extraordinary emerged in Ezra's calculations, the mathematics of accumulated affection, equations that proved love was not just metaphor but measurable force. The carrying seed responded most strongly, not to raw dimensional energy, but to the gentle power of spaces where people had chosen, again and again, to care for growing things, together. 26 days, Jerry said quietly. The developers noticed a whisper of urgency in his pocket, but the countdown had transformed from threat to timeline, from loss to transformation waiting to unfold. The seed pulsed with their combined heartbeats now, and when Ezra held his device close to its surface, the reading showed something unprecedented. Dimensional stability powered by accumulated tenderness, space folded not by force, but by the patient architecture of belonging. I think it's ready for a small test, Ezra said, his voice carrying careful hope. Something that wouldn't mind being first to trust us with the journey. Jerry's gaze moved across the garden with thoughtful assessment, settling finally on a small pot of mint that had been struggling since the heat wave, its leaves drooping despite attentive care. This one, he said gently. It could use a fresh start somewhere kinder. The struggling mint sat between them like a small ambassador, preparing for an extraordinary journey, its drooping leaves testament to weeks of brave endurance in conditions that had never quite felt like home. Jerry cradled the terracotta pot, with the same gentle attention he'd shown Ezra that first night among the marigolds, whispering soft encouragements as if the plant could understand the weight of trust being placed in its tender roots. "We're going to teach you about belonging," he murmured, adjusting the soil with fingertips that carried the accumulated wisdom of countless mornings spent listening to what growing things needed most. Ezra aligned the carrying seed above the pot, his device humming with frequencies that had learned to harmonize with Jerry's heartbeat over these past weeks of shared discovery. The mathematics flowing across his readings weren't just measurements anymore. They were translations of care made visible, equations that proved attention could be quantified, and kindness had its own elegant geometry. The seed doesn't trap or compress, Ezra explained softly, watching the pod's surface shimmer with patterns that looked like cupped hands learning to hold water without spilling. It resonates with what we might call the frequency of belonging, finding the exact note where something feels most itself. When the carrying seed opened, it did so with the gentle grace of dawn breaking over still water, creating not a harsh portal, but a soft hollow, filled with light, that tasted of rosemary and afternoon sunshine. The space inside felt less like containment and more like embrace, a pocket of possibility where struggling things could remember their own resilience. As they lowered the mint into the seed's luminous cradle, the resonance wavered for a heartbeat, like a song uncertain of its key. Ezra felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes, the old instinct to force solutions through sheer intellectual will. But Jerry simply placed his palm near the pot's rim and began humming, not the exact three-note lullaby they'd lost to his calculation error, but something close enough to matter, untrained and perfect. The field steadied, the light warmed, and Ezra watched in wonder as his device's readings shifted from cautious to contented. The waveforms smoothed where Jerry's pulse met metal, creating harmonics that spoke of stability born not from technology alone, but from the patient architecture of witnessed care. "You're the anchor," Ezra whispered, recognition blooming like understanding finally finding fertile ground. The space listens to you because you know how to listen to it first. They waited together, not as scientists timing an experiment, but as friends keeping company with something learning to trust. When they opened the seed again, the mint emerged transformed. Leaves glossy with renewed vitality, stems standing straighter, the whole plant emanating the quiet confidence of something that had remembered its own song. Round trip successful, Ezra noted in his journal, but the words carried wonder rather than clinical satisfaction. Below his measurements, he added, resonance stabilized by shared attention, home frequency anchored by Jerry's presence. Some equations can only be solved by hearts brave enough to trust. Outside, 24 days remained until the garden faced its ending. Inside, the mint stood taller in its pot, and the carrying seed pulsed with the gentle rhythm of a solution that felt less like invention and more like grace finally allowed to unfold. Tomorrow we teach it the whole garden, Ezra said softly. Every path you've worn, every greeting you've whispered to roses. Jerry nodded, his smile warm as late sunshine. We'll walk it slowly, so it can learn to love what we're trying to save. The morning they chose to teach the carrying seed. The language of belonging arrived painted in watercolors of possibility, soft light filtering through leaves that had learned to lean toward voices speaking kindness. Ezra cradled the pod between his palms, while Jerry led their gentle pilgrimage through paths worn smooth by years of patient tending, each step a deliberate act of translation between what the heart knew and what science could measure. We'll start where love visits most regularly, Jerry said softly, guiding them to Mrs. Chen's roses where dew still held fragments of dawn like tiny promises. She comes at 7:15 every morning, always pauses right here where the climbing rose meets the fence post. Sometimes she hums while she looks at them, old songs her mother taught her about flowers that remember being appreciated. The Phi. Seed's surface shimmered as Ezra held it near the roses, its glow deepening to the warm amber of accumulated affection. Through his device, he could hear the faint echo of countless mornings, not Mrs. Chen's actual voice, but the resonance her. Attention had left woven into the air around petals that had shaped themselves toward her daily presence. He made a gentle note, rose frequency, the mathematics of being consistently noticed. They moved through the garden like careful archaeologists mapping territories of care, stopping at the bench where pigeon feathers still marked the spot where the elderly gentleman scattered breadcrumbs with the patient precision of someone who understood that small acts of feeding could hold back loneliness for another day. The seed pulsed with recognition, learning the frequency of kindness given without expectation of return. He calls them his feathered philosophers, Jerry explained as they approached, and right on schedule, the gentleman arrived with his paper bag of crumbs, tipping his cap at Jerry before settling into his ritual of quiet companionship. The carrying seed warmed in Ezra's hands as it absorbed the gentle rhythm of shared solitude, the particular resonance of wisdom exchanged in comfortable silence. At the herb spiral, where basil and rosemary grew strong under Jerry's whispered encouragements, the seed's response became profound, its light shifting to the deep gold of attention given freely. My grandmother taught me that everything grows better when it knows it's being noticed, Jerry said, his hands finding the soil, where countless conversations with growing things had left their invisible mark. When they reached the tomato patch where their friendship had first taken root, something extraordinary happened. The carrying seed touched the earth near the heavy-laden vines, and the entire garden seemed to exhale a gentle sigh of recognition that rippled from plant to plant like news of safety being passed along roots and through air, thick with accumulated contentment. It's learning the emotional geography, Ezra whispered, his voice thick with wonder as he watched his readings translate what poets had always claimed, that places touched by consistent kindness developed their own gravity, their own gentle pull that made hearts feel safe enough to unfold. The seed settled into perfect resonance with the garden's heartbeat, holding not just botanical data, but the living memory of every morning greeting, every patient watering, every gentle word spoken, to leaves that had learned to listen. 23 days remained, but the countdown had transformed completely, not time running out, but time enough to move love from one place to another, to teach the carrying seed how to hold the accumulated tenderness that had made ordinary soil into sacred ground. The morning after their pilgrimage through the garden's emotional geography brought with it the weight of accumulated wonder and the gentle exhaustion that follows deep listening. The carrying seed rested between them at the kitchen table, pulsing with the steady rhythm of a heart that had learned to hold the accumulated tenderness of countless mornings. But something in its resonance had shifted overnight, a subtle tremor, like uncertainty learning to speak. Ezra noticed it first in his readings, micro-fluctuations in the seed's stability that shouldn't exist, tiny variations that made his device hum with the electronic equivalent of worry. The emotional mapping was successful, he murmured, checking calculations that had been perfect yesterday. But there's something else, a frequency I didn't account for. Jerry leaned closer, studying not the numbers but Ezra's face, reading the familiar signs of a brilliant mind beginning to chase solutions through increasingly complex territories. What kind of something? Sadness, Ezra said softly, the word carrying surprise. The garden is grieving. All this accumulated love, all these relationships we've mapped, they're beautiful, but they're also farewells. Every rose Mrs. Chen has whispered to, every conversation you've shared with the tomatoes, the garden knows it's leaving home. The revelation should have felt like progress, but instead it settled around them like the particular weight that comes with understanding. Problems that can't be solved through intellect alone. Ezra felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes, the old urgency rising as he began sketching equations for emotional resonance, formulas for quantifying grief, mathematical approaches to healing a heartbroken ecosystem. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, his calculations grew more frantic and less effective. The carrying seed's tremor persisted despite every theoretical solution he devised, and by evening, Ezra sat surrounded by discarded notes, his coffee cold, his hands shaking, with the particular exhaustion of someone whose greatest strength had become suddenly insufficient. "I can measure the sadness," he said quietly when Jerry found him there, "but I can't solve it. How do you comfort an entire garden?" Jerry settled beside him with the patient presence of someone who had learned that some questions needed sitting with before they revealed their answers. "The same way you comfort anything that's hurting," he said simply. "You stay close. You listen. You let it know it's not alone in the scary parts." Together, they returned to the garden as twilight painted, the sky in gentle watercolors. Jerry moved among the plants with his usual unhurried attention, but now his whispered conversations carried different weight. Not just daily greetings, but acknowledgments of fear, promises that love would travel with them, assurances that being transplanted didn't mean being forgotten. As Jerry spoke to roses about new soil that would learn to love them, as he promised tomatoes that their next home would have morning sun and patient hands, the carrying seed's tremor began to settle. The device at Ezra's wrist recorded what his heart already understood. Some equations could only be balanced by presence, some instabilities could only be resolved by the patient application of witnessed care. 22 days remained, but the countdown had transformed once again. Not time running out, but time enough to teach a grieving garden that love could survive the journey between worlds. The morning brought Mrs. Chen earlier than usual, her footsteps carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent the night wrestling with unwelcome news. She paused at her roses, as always, but today her whispered greeting trembled with the recognition that safe places weren't always permanent. From the kitchen window, Jerry and Ezra watched her pull the crumpled notice from her pocket, reading it again with the careful attention of someone hoping words might change overnight. "She knows," Jerry said softly, and the carrying seed pulsed with shared sorrow, its light shifting to acknowledge the grief spreading through their small community. By afternoon, others had arrived, the elderly gentleman lingering longer on his bench, a young mother teaching her toddler the names of flowers, as if passing along essential knowledge before time ran out. But something beautiful began emerging from their collective sadness. Mrs. Chen showed the mother which roses bloomed longest. The gentleman taught a teenager the patient art of scattering breadcrumbs so pigeons felt welcome rather than startled. "They're not just grieving," Jerry observed, his voice brightening with recognition. "They're sharing what they know, teaching each other how to carry the love forward." The carrying seed responded to this community weaving with growing warmth, but Ezra sensed it needed something more, not just present connections, but the accumulated weight of all the small moments that had made this place sacred. "There's somewhere we need to go," he said quietly, his device detecting a frequency that whispered of things almost forgotten. A place where lost moments wait to be remembered. The portal opened with the gentle courtesy of recognition, revealing a vast, softly lit gallery where countless translucent spheres held fragments of time. Mrs. Chen's first shy greeting to a climbing rose, the exact weight of breadcrumbs in an old man's palm, a child's wonder at discovering that flowers had names worth learning. A curator drifted toward them with moth-like grace. "We preserve what was never properly thanked," she said, offering. "Ezra, a ribbon the color of rain at dusk. Thread with gratitude, memory will follow." As Ezra wove the ribbon through the seed's edges, Jerry spoke names aloud, every person who had found belonging in their small garden, every moment of care that had accumulated like dew on patient leaves. The carrying seed received each threaded memory like a gift, its tremor settling into steady contentment as it learned to hold not just botanical data, but the living archive of connection that made ordinary soil into sacred ground. They returned, to find the garden breathing easier, the mathematics of gratitude knitting itself across boundaries no formula had ever crossed. The community still gathered, still shared their knowledge, but now their grief had transformed into something stronger, the recognition that love multiplied when witnessed, that the strongest gardens grew from hearts choosing to tend the same small patch of earth together. 21 days remained, but the countdown no longer felt like loss approaching. Instead, it felt like time enough to teach the seed the most important lesson, that home wasn't just a place, but the accumulated tenderness of everyone who had chosen to care for it. The ribbon of gratitude had woven something unprecedented into the carrying seed's matrix, not just stability, but what Ezra's readings could only describe as anticipation. Word had spread through the community with the gentle persistence of morning glory vines, and by evening, neighbors gathered in the garden like pilgrims drawn to witness something sacred taking shape. Mrs. Chen arrived first, carrying cuttings from her grandmother's rosebush wrapped in newspaper that smelled of jasmine tea and old stories. The elderly gentleman followed with a mason jar of breadcrumbs, blessed by countless mornings of shared solitude with grateful pigeons. "We want to help," Mrs. Chen said simply. "This place taught us how to be neighbors." As each person offered their contribution, soil blessed by small hands, learning to distinguish flowers from weeds, seeds saved from particularly generous harvests, pressed leaves that held the memory of perfect autumn afternoons, the carrying seed began to harmonize with their offerings. Ezra watched in wonder as his device translated the phenomenon into readings that looked more like music than mathematics. "It's becoming a choir," he whispered to Jerry, who moved among the neighbors with gentle grace, showing each person how to whisper the stories that made their contributions more than botanical specimens. But as the seed's resonance grew stronger, something shifted in the air above the garden, a sharp, aggressive shimmer that made Ezra's device pulse with warning frequencies. A figure emerged through the harsh light, and Ezra felt uncomfortable recognition settle in his chest. It was himself, but stripped of every gentle edge Jerry had helped him cultivate, lab coat immaculately white, eyes holding the cold brilliance of someone who saw the universe as problems to be conquered rather than mysteries to be shared. "Impressive work," the alternate Ezra said, his voice a precise echo devoid of warmth. His gaze swept dismissively over the gathered neighbors before settling on Jerry. "Though I see you've allowed significant inefficiencies to compromise your operational matrix, fortunately we've developed solutions for such emotional irregularities." Jerry listened with the patient dignity of someone whose roots ran too deep to be disturbed by harsh winds. When the alternate finished describing neural enhancements and cognitive optimization, Jerry simply smiled. "I'm quite happy as I am. Thank you. My imperfections included." Ezra stepped closer to Jerry, not as shield but as companion choosing the same ground. "We're keeping the drift," he said quietly. "The stumbles, the hesitations, the human tempo. That's what makes it work." The alternate Ezra's expression cooled. You're choosing limitation over infinite possibility. We're choosing connection over efficiency, Ezra replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Some equations can only be solved by hearts brave enough to stay imperfect together. As the harsh portal closed, Mrs. Chen stepped forward with the careful attention of someone remembering an essential detail. "Where will it go?" she asked. "Our garden. Where will it learn to be home again?" The question settled into the evening air like a gentle weight, and 20 days remained, not as countdown to loss, but as time enough to teach their accumulated love where to take root in soil that had been waiting for exactly this kind of tenderness to arrive. Mrs. Chen's questions settled into the night like seeds finding fertile ground, and by morning it had taken root in every conversation, every glance shared between neighbors who had learned that the most important discoveries often came wrapped in the simplest words. Where will it go? The question followed Ezra to his morning calculations and Jerry to his gentle rounds among plants that seemed to lean closer, listening for the answer that would determine their future. "We need to feel our way toward it," Jerry said softly, as they sat with the carrying seed pulsing between them like a compass made of accumulated tenderness. "Not just find coordinates, but recognize the heartbeat that matches ours." Ezra adjusted his device to scan for something unprecedented. Dimensional frequencies that resonated with kindness rather than energy, stability measured in comfort rather than mathematical constants. The first portal window opened onto crystalline beauty that made their breath catch, but the light was too sharp, too demanding. "The herbs would lose their whispers here," Jerry observed gently, and the carrying seed's glow dimmed in agreement. The second glimpse revealed vast meadows under endless sky, gorgeous and wild, but something in the wind spoke of loneliness too, profound for roses that had learned to expect daily greetings. They closed this window with gratitude, but without lingering. Then, as afternoon light slanted golden through the garden, a new frequency emerged. So soft, Ezra almost missed it, like a lullaby hummed just beyond hearing. The portal opened onto a valley where twilight lived in permanent gentle residence, neither day nor night, but the peaceful space between them. Ancient trees with bark like silver paper swayed in breezes that smelled of rain and remembrance, and the ground itself glowed with the faint luminescence of moss that had learned to hold starlight. "Oh," Mrs. Chen whispered as she joined them at the threshold. "It's been waiting." The carrying seed pulsed with recognition so profound that Ezra's readings shifted from measurement to music. This wasn't just compatible habitat, it was completion, the place their accumulated love had been unconsciously seeking. The elderly gentleman scattered breadcrumbs across the dimensional boundary, and birds unlike any they'd known arrived, singing in harmonies that sounded like welcome translated into wing beats. "The soil knows us," Jerry said with quiet certainty, kneeling to touch earth that crumbled perfectly between his fingers. "It's been listening for the sound of people who understand that the best gardens grow from patience and attention." As neighbors gathered around the gentle portal, mapping where roses would catch the perpetual twilight's kindness, and benches could be positioned for optimal bird feeding, Ezra realized they hadn't just found sanctuary. They had discovered the place their community had been traveling toward without knowing it, the destination their shared tenderness had been creating through years of small, daily choices to care for growing things together. 19 days remained, but the countdown had transformed completely, not time running out, but time enough to teach their garden how to unfold in soil that had been shaped by possibility itself, waiting for exactly this combination of love and courage to arrive. The morning of their first crossing arrived painted in the soft gold of decisions made with shared courage. The community gathered around the portal with the reverent attention of people witnessing something sacred taking shape, each person carrying offerings that spoke of trust made tangible. Mrs. Chen, with her carefully wrapped rose cuttings, the elderly gentleman with breadcrumbs, blessed by countless mornings of patient kindness. "The marigolds should go first," Mrs. Chen said softly, kneeling beside the bright guardians that had cushioned Ezra's own arrival weeks ago. "Let them be our lanterns, lighting the way for everything that follows." The decision settled into the morning air with the rightness of recognition, and the carrying seed warmed in Ezra's hands, as if it too understood the poetry of beginning with flowers that had learned to welcome strangers. Jerry moved among the marigolds with his familiar tenderness, loosening soil that had held these roots through seasons of patient growth, whispering gratitude before lifting them toward their extraordinary journey. As the community formed a gentle circle around the portal, something remarkable happened. Ezra felt his usual anxiety about the weight of responsibility transform into something lighter, the recognition that he wasn't carrying this alone. Each person's attention became part of the equation, their shared hope creating stability fields. His device had never registered before. Mrs. Chen's steady breathing, the elderly gentleman's patient presence, Jerry's unwavering faith, all of it wove into the mathematics of connection that held the portal steady. "We're not just moving plants," Jerry observed as they guided the marigolds into the seed's luminous embrace. "We're moving the love that made them grow." The transfer unfolded with ceremonial grace, the carrying seed opening like cupped hands, learning to hold water without spilling. The marigolds emerged in the twilight valley without shock or trauma, settling into new soil like travelers recognizing a promised shore. Their golden faces turned toward the gentle perpetual dusk, and immediately the moss around them brightened as if catching familiar sunlight in a place that had never known noon. Ezra recorded data that would later reshape how he understood the universe itself, readings that proved attention could be measured, that care functioned as a stabilizing force across dimensional boundaries. In his notebook, beneath equations that curved like embrace, he wrote a phrase that would have seemed impossible weeks ago: "Love holds." Mrs. Chen pressed her hands to her heart, then to the new earth. "We brought them," she whispered, and the words felt like a blessing spoken in both directions across the threshold between worlds. That evening, as the first stars appeared in both realities, 18 days remained, not as countdown to loss, but as time enough to teach their entire garden how to unfold in soil that had been waiting for exactly this combination of courage and tenderness to arrive. The marigolds glowed gently in both places, like a string of small suns guiding travelers across a kindly night. The success of the marigolds had woven itself into the morning air like a gentle benediction, and by the fourth day, their small golden faces glowed in both realities, beacons guiding the careful procession of everything that would follow. The community had settled into a rhythm that felt like prayer made visible, gathering each morning around the portal with the quiet reverence of people witnessing love learn to travel between worlds. Ezra discovered something that made him smile. Despite the scientist in him, the carrying seed stabilized fastest when sandwiches were shared. He wrote it down without irony. Field strength improves during communal nourishment, and Jerry's soft laughter carried the satisfaction of someone whose grandmother's wisdom had finally been scientifically validated. "The tomatoes today," Mrs. Chen said gently, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. She knelt beside the heavy-laden vines where Ezra's journey had begun, where countless conversations between Jerry and growing things had accumulated like dew on patient leaves. "They're the heart of everything here. The rest of us just learn to grow around them." The carrying seed pulsed with what Ezra's readings could only translate as profound anticipation. These plants carried frequencies so intricate they resembled symphonies, not just botanical data, but the living archive of every whispered encouragement, every gentle adjustment, every morning greeting that had shaped them into more than vegetables, into companions. As they began the delicate work of loosening soil around roots that had anchored memories as much as stems, a young mother arrived with her toddler, who immediately began singing to the tomatoes in the wordless melody children use when they want, growing things to feel brave. The carrying seed's light deepened to warm amber, and Ezra felt something shift in his readings. Not just measurement, but translation of courage made audible. "Plants need songs for big changes," Jerry observed, his hands moving among the vines with infinite tenderness. "She understands that better than most adults." The first tomato vine emerged in the twilight valley, like a traveler recognizing a promised shore, its roots finding the silver moss soil with immediate trust. But something extraordinary happened as they continued. Each successive plant seemed to carry messages from those already settled, frequencies of reassurance that whispered across dimensional boundaries in languages older than words. "They're teaching each other how to be brave," Ezra said softly, his device recording conversations happening in harmonics that bypassed intellect entirely. "The garden is learning to comfort itself." The elderly gentleman scattered breadcrumbs for birds that had never seen breadcrumbs before, and they landed with the cautious hope of creatures recognizing kindness in any language. Mrs. Chen knelt in new soil, whispering to her roses about patience and trust, while the moss around transplanted roots began to glow more brightly, as if the valley itself was learning to accommodate familiar forms of love. 17 days remained, but the countdown had transformed completely. Not time running out, but time enough to witness the profound mathematics of connection, to discover that the strongest roots were those brave enough to reach towards soil that had been waiting all along, to be found by exactly this combination of courage and accumulated tenderness. The morning after the tomatoes had found their footing in silver moss soil brought visitors who arrived with the careful precision of people following rumors that seemed too gentle to be scientific breakthroughs. 2 young researchers stood at the garden's edge, their pristine notebooks and sensor equipment creating sharp contrasts against the soft chaos of growing things, learning to trust interdimensional travel. Ezra recognized the hungry brightness, in their eyes, the same intensity he'd once carried like armor against a universe that demanded proof of worth through intellectual achievement. But now, watching them approach with instruments raised like shields, he felt only the patient warmth of someone who had learned that the most profound discoveries often began with setting down what you thought you needed to carry. "Dr. Quantum," the taller student said, her voice carrying the formal respect reserved for published authorities, "we've read your paper on emotional quantum entanglement. We're here to study your translocation methodology." Ezra looked up from where he knelt beside Mrs. Chen, both of them whispering encouragement to a particularly nervous patch of herbs, preparing for their journey across realities. His hands were soil-stained, his device humming with the contentment of technology that had learned to harmonize with heartbeats, and his eyes held the soft focus of someone who measured progress in comfort, given rather than problems conquered. "The methodology," he said gently, rising with the unhurried grace Jerry had taught him, "begins with asking whether the basil has had enough water today and whether anyone has thanked the roses for being so patient with our strange plans." The students exchanged glances that spoke of expectations being redirected toward territories their textbooks had never mapped. Jerry appeared as if summoned by the particular quality of confusion that comes from brilliant minds encountering wisdom that refuses to fit into familiar frameworks. He carried a tray with sandwiches cut diagonally, and tea that smelled of chamomile, and accumulated mornings. "We calibrate with care first," Ezra explained, offering cups that warmed hands before warming theories. "Field strength improves during communal nourishment. It's not poetry, it's measurable physics, but the kind that only reveals itself when instruments learn to listen alongside hearts." The shorter student opened her sensor case with the reverence of someone unveiling sacred equipment, but the sharp electronic whine that emerged made the carrying seed pulse with distress, its warm amber glow flickering toward uncertainty. Ezra raised a gentle hand before any measurements could begin. "The room needs to know it's being respected before it will share its secrets," he said softly, closing the case with the same care one might use to settle a frightened bird. "Listen first. Record after trust has been established." Instead of sensors, he placed watering cans in their eager hands, guiding them toward plants that had learned to lean into attention, given freely. "Tell them something true," Jerry suggested with his familiar warmth. "Not about science, about you." The taller student knelt beside a cluster of mint, her formal posture softening as she whispered that her grandmother had grown herbs in coffee, cans on a fire escape, teaching her that growing things could thrive anywhere love was patient enough to tend them. The plant's leaves lifted with recognition, and the carrying seed's glow steadied, translating the frequency of shared memory into harmonics that curved like embrace. When the shorter student confessed her fear of achieving brilliance but remaining alone, the rosemary's fragrance deepened, and Ezra's device recorded waveforms that looked less like data and more like arms learning how to hold. The students watched in wonder as their honesty became part of the equation. Their vulnerabilities transformed into stabilizing forces that made interdimensional travel feel less like conquest and more like invitation. "You weren't wrong to bring instruments," Ezra said as they gathered around the portal where herbs waited for their crossing, 15 days remaining in their gentle countdown. "Just remember what they can't measure unless you help them. Attention, gratitude, the way a room changes when people choose kindness over efficiency." Together, they guided oregano and thyme through the patient light, watching the twilight valley receive each plant with the moss glow of recognition. The students recorded everything, but their notes had transformed. Less technical specification, more translation of wonder into language that could carry the weight of what they'd witnessed. As evening painted both realities in watercolors of possibility, the researchers closed their notebooks with the quiet reverence of people who had discovered that the most elegant solutions often grew from soil blessed by accumulated tenderness, tended by hands brave enough to choose connection over conquest, presence over the cold comfort of being right alone. "We'll return tomorrow," the taller student promised, her voice carrying new softness, with fewer instruments and more willingness to listen. "Bring stories next time," Jerry suggested warmly. "The seed learns best from those." 15 days remained, but the countdown had become celebration. Time enough to teach young minds that the universe's most beautiful secrets revealed themselves not to brilliance working in isolation, but to hearts patient enough to discover that some equations could only be solved by choosing, again and again, to care for growing things together. The students returned the next morning, carrying notebooks filled with handwritten stories instead of electronic readings, their faces bright, with the particular wonder that comes from discovering that the most profound measurements often happen in the space between heartbeats. Maya spoke of her grandfather's greenhouse, where orchids learned to bloom for whispered encouragements in 3 languages, while David shared how his mother's kitchen herbs had taught him that growing things responded better to conversation than fertilizer. "The instruments taught us precision," Maya said softly as they gathered around the portal where the last cluster of herbs waited for their journey. "But the stories taught us presence." The carrying seed pulsed with recognition, its warm glow deepening as it absorbed these new frequencies of connection. Ezra found himself smiling as he recorded readings that looked less like data and more like music, waveforms that curved like embrace, stability measurements that improved when laughter was shared. As they guided oregano and thyme through the gentle light, watching the twilight valley receive each plant with moss-bright welcome, something began taking shape in the space between Ezra's scientific mind and Jerry's patient wisdom. Not just a solution to their current need, but a vision of something more lasting, a place that could hold the accumulated tenderness they'd discovered together. "We need a room," Ezra said quietly, the idea arriving with the certainty of recognition rather than invention. Not in one reality or the other, but in the space between them, a place that remembers. Jerry's eyes brightened with understanding. "Like a porch that faces both directions," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had always known that the best conversations happened in threshold spaces. With 2 chairs and a window that shows whatever needs seeing, the community gathered as Ezra began the delicate work of weaving such a space into existence, using the carrying seed's accumulated wisdom as foundation. Mrs. Chen contributed her grandmother's embroidered cloth. The elderly gentleman offered a worn plank from his favorite bench, and the students set aside their notebooks to help arrange simple furniture that invited rest rather than demanded attention. When the room breathed itself into being, a gentle hollow of light that existed in both realities simultaneously, it felt less like creation and more like discovery. The window showed the twilight valley in one pane and their familiar courtyard in the other, while the kettle found its perfect place on a shelf that had been waiting for exactly this combination of function and comfort. "Tomorrow we bring the last of the roses," Jerry said as they settled into chairs that had learned to hold conversations as well as bodies. The room hummed with contentment around them, a sanctuary built from accumulated moments of choosing presence over efficiency, connection over conquest. 14 days remained, But the countdown had transformed completely, not time running out, but time enough to teach their interdimensional threshold how to hold the patient mathematics of love, where the most important discoveries would always happen in the gentle space between two people who had learned to tend growing things together across any distance the universe might place between worlds. The morning light that found their interdimensional room carried the particular quality of recognition, soft and golden, painting everything with the warmth of spaces that had learned to hold love without urgency. Mrs. Chen arrived early, her arms cradling the last of her grandmother's roses, wrapped in silk scarves that whispered with the accumulated prayers of 3 generations of women who had understood that some things were too precious to trust to anything but the gentlest. Hansi Ezra felt the familiar flutter of anticipation as he calibrated the carrying seed, but something deeper moved beneath the surface, a tender anxiety that had nothing to do with dimensional physics and everything to do with watching Jerry move through their morning ritual with steps that carried the almost imperceptible weight of accumulated days. Not frailty, but the kind of careful grace that comes from a body learning to honor its own rhythms, to move with the patience it had always given to growing things. "The oldest rose first," Mrs. Chen said softly, kneeling beside a bush whose roots had anchored decades of whispered conversations. "She's been listening to my family's voices longer than anyone can remember. She deserves to lead the way." As they began the delicate work of loosening soil around roots that held more than botanical memory, the rose trembled, not with fear, but with the profound reluctance of something that had learned to call a particular patch of earth home. The carrying seed flickered, responding to frequencies of attachment so deep they registered as grief made visible. Maya stepped forward, her notebook forgotten, and began to hum, a melody her grandmother had sung to coax shy flowers into bloom. David joined with his uncertain but earnest voice, and then Mrs. Chen, whose song carried the weight of lullabies that had traveled across oceans and generations. The elderly gentleman added his weathered harmony, and Jerry's gentle bass wrapped around them all like arms learning to hold. The rose's tremor steadied as the chorus grew, and Ezra watched his readings transform from jagged anxiety into curves that looked unmistakably like embrace. The community had become part of the equation, their shared attention creating stability fields his device had never imagined possible. He wrote quickly in his margins, grief gentled by chorus, underlining it twice, not for scientific accuracy, but for the profound truth of witnessing love learn to travel between worlds. When the oldest rose settled into twilight soil, it released, a sigh so deep that even the instruments could translate it, recognition, gratitude, the particular relief of roots finding earth that had been waiting for exactly this combination of courage and accumulated tenderness. The silver moss around its base brightened, and the perpetual dusk seemed to deepen its embrace, welcoming another refugee from a world that had forgotten how to make room for growing things. As afternoon painted both realities in watercolors of possibility, they gathered in their threshold room where the kettle sang its contented note, and chairs had learned to hold conversations as comfortably as bodies. Jerry settled into his favorite spot, with the subtle heaviness of someone who had spent the morning translating love into action, and Ezra found himself moving without conscious thought to tuck a folded blanket around Jerry's knees, a gesture that spoke of attention learned, care given freely. "Soup tonight?" Ezra asked quietly, his voice carrying the particular tenderness of someone who had discovered that the most elegant solutions often involved asking gentle questions about comfort. "With basil," Jerry replied, his smile bright despite the tiredness that painted soft shadows beneath his eyes. "The kind that remembers summer and doesn't mind sharing its memories." Maya opened a plain blue ledger that had appeared on their small table, its pages waiting with the patience of something that understood its purpose. "For visitors," she explained softly. "People who might need to know they're welcome here." Ezra took the offered pen and wrote in careful lines that curved, like embrace. "If you are tired, sit. If you are lost, listen. If you are hungry, there is bread and kindness." He passed the pen to Jerry, who added, "You are welcome here, exactly as you are, even if you're still finding your way." The room accepted their words with visible contentment, the light warming, the kettle's song deepening to something that sounded like gratitude made audible. Through the window, they watched the transplanted garden breathe in both realities, roots finding their footing in soil that had learned to accommodate familiar forms of love. 11 days, Ezra said quietly, the countdown no longer carrying. The weight of ending, but the lighter promise of transformation approaching completion. And then? Jerry asked, his voice carrying the same patient hope he used when speaking to struggling seedlings. Ezra looked around their threshold sanctuary, at the window that showed whatever needed witnessing, at the chairs that invited rest, at the kettle that sang welcome to anyone brave enough to cross between worlds seeking refuge. Then we tend what we've planted together, he said softly. We help other gardens find their way to safety when they need it. We discover what grows when love learns it doesn't have to choose between brilliance and belonging. Outside, the first stars appeared in the valley's perpetual twilight, shy and generous, while their own sky began to pierce with points of ancient light. The community moved through both realities with the comfortable rhythm of people who had learned that the most important work happened in the gentle spaces between worlds, where hearts chose connection over conquest, presence over the cold comfort of being remarkable alone. 11 days remained, not as warning but as promise that there was still time to carry what mattered the way good hands carry seedlings, without rushing, without forcing, keeping everything safe until it was ready, to take root in soil that had been waiting all along, to be found by exactly this combination of courage and accumulated tenderness. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing, with mornings devoted to the careful work of transplantation and evenings gathered in their threshold, room where the kettle sang its contented note, and stories accumulated like dew on patient leaves. Maya and David had become fixtures in their interdimensional sanctuary, their notebooks transformed from clinical observations into journals that curved with wonder, recording not just dimensional frequencies, but the way shared soup improved. Portal harmonics, how Jerry's gentle encouragements made even the most reluctant plants settle peacefully into silver moss soil. We're writing our thesis differently, Maya confessed, as they sat around the small table where afternoon light painted everything in watercolors of possibility. Not about conquering interdimensional space, but about creating places where connection can flourish across any distance. Ezra smiled, remembering his own transformation from someone who measured the universe to someone who had learned to listen to its heartbeat. But as he watched Jerry move between realities with his familiar, unhurried grace, he noticed changes that spoke of time's own patient mathematics, not illness but the natural slowing that comes when a life lived with attention begins to gather its accumulated wisdom like a gardener collecting seeds at season's end. "Are you tired?" Ezra asked quietly as they guided a cluster of particularly stubborn mint through the portal, watching Jerry's hands work with the same tenderness, but requiring more deliberate pauses between movements. "Content tired," Jerry replied, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of work, completed with love. Like after a good day in the garden when everything that needed tending got the attention it deserved. The afternoon brought the elderly gentleman with his weathered hands full of breadcrumbs and stories, Mrs. Chen with cuttings that carried 3 generations of whispered encouragements, and a young mother whose toddler had learned to hum encouragement to nervous seedlings. As they worked together, something extraordinary began to emerge, not just in Ezra's readings, which now looked more like music than mathematics, but in the air itself. 3 gentle notes, rising and falling like breath, began to weave through their conversations, not a recording returning, but the melody finding them again because they had created the proper conditions. A room full of listening hearts, hands working in harmony, voices that had learned to speak the language of growing things. It never lived in the device, Ezra murmured, watching his instruments translate what the heart already knew, that some frequencies could only be preserved by communities brave enough to sing them together. It lives where we hold it together. As evening painted both realities in gentle watercolors, they gathered in their threshold sanctuary where the window held both landscapes without strain. David sketched the day's transplants with the care of someone tracing beloved faces, while Maya recorded conversations that blurred the beautiful boundary between botany and soul. The elderly gentleman settled into his favorite chair with the particular contentment of someone whose stories had found their proper audience, and Mrs. Chen prepared tea that tasted of gratitude made drinkable. "Tomorrow, we move the herb spiral," Jerry said, adjusting the blanket that had become his evening companion. "The basil will want to teach the new soil about summer memories." Ezra nodded, feeling the garden's hum settle into a steady cadence inside his chest. Through their window, he could see the transplanted roses beginning to glow more brightly in the Twilight Valley's perpetual dusk, their roots learning to trust silver moss that had been waiting centuries for exactly this combination of courage and accumulated tenderness. 8 days remained, but the countdown had transformed completely, not time running out, but time enough to witness the profound mathematics of connection, to discover that the strongest foundations were built from accumulated moments of choosing presence over efficiency, belonging over the cold comfort of being brilliant alone. The community had become part of the equation, their shared attention creating stability fields that proved love was not just metaphor, but measurable force, powerful enough to carry entire ecosystems across the vast distances between worlds. In D, his notebook beside equations that curved like embrace, Ezra wrote a line that would reshape how he understood the universe itself. Home frequency amplified by chorus. Some songs can only be preserved by hearts brave enough to sing them together. The kettle sang its evening note, and somewhere in the space between heartbeats, between realities, their garden continued its patient work of teaching the twilight valley how to hold the accumulated tenderness that had made ordinary soil into sacred ground. The morning light that found their interdimensional room carried the particular quality of recognition, soft and golden, painting everything with the warmth of spaces that had learned to hold love without urgency. Ezra woke first, as had become his habit, and found himself studying Jerry's sleeping face with the tender attention of someone who had learned that the most profound equations often revealed themselves in the space between heartbeats, in the gentle mathematics of caring for another soul. Jerry stirred with the unhurried grace of someone whose body had begun requesting patience as its preferred language, and Ezra felt something shift in his chest, not worry, but the recognition that care could be offered as naturally as breathing, without diminishing anyone's dignity in the process. "Let me make the soup first," Ezra said softly, the decision forming like breath finding its natural rhythm. Basil that remembers sunshine, and the small noodles that make bowls feel friendly. Jerry's smile carried the grateful acceptance of someone whose roots ran deep enough to welcome support when it was offered with love. "And maybe a story while it simmers," he suggested, settling into his chair with the quilt that had first welcomed Ezra from the marigolds, about the herb. Spiral's first morning in our old garden, when the rosemary was just learning how to be brave. In the kitchen corner of their between places room, Ezra moved with the unhurried attention Jerry had taught him, tasting as he went, letting the broth become conversation rather than task. Maya and David arrived with notebooks softened by use, and stories tucked into their sleeves, settling at the table, as if they had always known where the bowls lived, where the spoons felt most comfortable in familiar hands. "The spiral can wait until afternoon," Ezra told them, ladling soup that smelled of green things and accumulated mornings. "We go slower today. We listen longer to what everything needs." As they shared bread and broth that tasted like patience, made edible, something extraordinary began to weave through their conversation, 3 gentle notes rising and falling like breath, growing stronger with each shared story. The melody of the singing flower had found them again, not as recording or memory, but as living frequency that could only be heard when hearts sang together. "It never lived in the device," Ezra murmured, watching his instruments translate what the heart already knew. "It lives where we hold it together, where we remember to listen with more than our minds." When afternoon painted both realities in watercolors of possibility, they approached the herb spiral with the reverent attention of people performing a sacred ceremony. The basil and rosemary, mint and thyme waited like patient teachers, each plant carrying not just botanical memory, but the accumulated whispers of countless mornings when Jerry had knelt in soil that crumbled perfectly between loving fingers. The Fae, Carrying seed warmed in Ezra's hands as the community gathered, Mrs. Chen with her thermos of ginger tea, the elderly gentleman scattering breadcrumbs that felt like blessings, Maya and David no longer observers, but participants in something that transcended scientific documentation. Without Jerry at the center of the work, a small uncertainty rippled through the field, readings that wavered like a room noticing a beloved voice had stepped into the next space. "Let's bring his kind of listening with us," Maya suggested softly, opening their visitor ledger to pages where strangers had written simple truths about finding welcome. David began humming, uncertain at first, then settling into harmony as others joined, their voices weaving the stability that instruments alone could never provide. The field steadied, and as they lifted the herb spiral toward its extraordinary journey, the singing flower's melody grew strong enough to translate across dimensions. The basil emerged in the twilight valley with leaves that seemed to exhale summer itself, teaching the silver moss about the particular warmth that comes from being consistently noticed, consistently loved. "It's sharing its memories with the moss," Maya whispered, her instruments recording conversations happening in frequencies too gentle for ordinary hearing, patterns of light spreading beneath transplanted roots like gratitude made visible. Back. In their threshold room, Jerry settled into his chair with the deep satisfaction of work completed with love, and Ezra found himself moving without conscious thought to adjust the blanket around Jerry's knees, a gesture that spoke of attention, learned, care given freely. "The community board tomorrow," Jerry said, his voice bright despite the tiredness that painted soft shadows beneath his eyes. "It should be the last thing to cross over, the memory keeper, where neighbors learn to share more than notices about lost cats." Through their window, they watched the transplanted herbs settle into patterns that caught the valley's perpetual twilight, like nets designed to hold starlight. The elderly gentleman had found the perfect spot for his morning breadcrumb ritual, where birds, unlike any they'd known, landed with the cautious hope of creatures recognizing kindness in any language. David closed his notebook with the reverent attention of someone preserving something sacred. "We're documenting more than botanical translocation," he said quietly. "We're recording the physics of community, the mathematics of how shared attention creates stability across impossible distances." As evening folded its soft edges around both worlds, the kettle sang its contented note, and somewhere in the space between heartbeats, their garden continued its patient work of teaching the Twilight Valley how to hold the accumulated tenderness that had made ordinary soil into sacred ground. 7 days remained until the original garden faced its scheduled ending, but the countdown had become celebration. Time enough to witness the profound discovery that the strongest foundations were built from accumulated moments of choosing presence over efficiency, connection over the cold comfort of being remarkable alone. The singing flower's melody wove through their evening like a gentle benediction, reminding them that some things, once truly known and held in community, could never truly be lost. In his notebook, beside equations that curved like embrace, Ezra wrote a line that captured the day's teaching: home frequency amplified by chorus. The most elegant solutions grow from soil blessed by accumulated tenderness, tended by hands brave enough to choose connection across any distance the universe might place between worlds. The morning arrived painted in watercolors of completion, soft light filtering through windows that had learned to show two worlds without strain. Ezra woke to find Jerry already dressed, moving through their threshold room with the careful grace of someone whose body had begun requesting patience as its preferred language. Not frailty, but the natural slowing that comes when accumulated. Wisdom settles into bones like sediment in still water. "The community board today," Jerry said, his voice carrying the gentle weight of someone preparing to move a beloved memory. 15 years of neighbors learning to trust each other with lost cats and borrowed sugar, written in thumbtack holes and faded ink. The weathered cork surface waited like a patient teacher, its layers telling the archaeology of shared life. Thank you notes from children whose careful drawings had made flowers feel appreciated. Recipes exchanged between gardens that had learned to overflow. Notices about found keys that had reunited strangers with their own front doors. Ezra's device translated what the heart already understood. The board pulsed with frequencies so complex they resembled symphonies, each message carrying the accumulated weight of connection made visible. Mrs. Chen arrived with her thermos of ginger tea, the elderly gentleman with breadcrumbs that felt like blessings, Maya and David with notebooks that had learned to curve equations like embrace. But as they prepared the carrying seed for this final task, something in its harmony faltered, a subtle discord that spoke of energy reserves approaching their gentle limits. "It's tired," Ezra said quietly, watching waveforms that had grown, increasingly delicate over weeks of carrying love across impossible distances. Like someone who has given everything they have and needs rest. "Maybe it doesn't need to carry everything," Jerry observed thoughtfully, running weathered fingers along edges that had framed countless small acts of community. "Maybe some things are meant to stay, to teach the next garden how to begin." Together they began the careful work of preservation, photographing each notice with reverence, copying what needed saving into Maya's blue ledger. The children's thank you notes, recipes seasoned with attention, simple expressions of gratitude written in careful cursive by hands that had learned appreciation, could fit on index cards but still change entire days. As afternoon painted both. Realities in gentle watercolors. A teenager paused at their threshold. Someone Ezra had seen skating past the garden for months, hovering now with the careful politeness of uncertainty made visible. "I'm Noor," he said, voice carrying the particular hope of someone testing whether kindness might be real. "My aunt says you help neighbors find each other. Could someone add a flyer? My cousin needs work." "Come in," Jerry said before the sentence, finished welcome folding around Noor like a quilt that had been waiting for exactly this size person. "Bring yourself too." The community board settled into the twilight valley like a teacher finding its proper classroom, cork surface immediately, beginning to glow with moss-light recognition. Noor pinned his cousin's notice to the center with the reverent attention of someone learning that small acts of posting could be forms of prayer, while around them the transplanted garden breathed with the deep contentment of roots that had found soil shaped by possibility itself. 6 days, Ezra said quietly as they gathered in their threshold room where the kettle sang its evening note. Through their window, both realities held the accumulated tenderness they had carried across impossible distances, teaching the twilight valley how to hold the patient mathematics of community. The carrying seed rested between them, its work nearly complete, pulsing with the gentle rhythm of something that had learned the most elegant solutions often grew from soil blessed by accumulated moments of choosing presence over efficiency, connection over the cold comfort of being remarkable alone. The morning of the 5th day brought a different quality to the light filtering through their threshold room, not just illumination, but the gentle weight of completion approaching like tide returning to familiar shore. The carrying seed rested between them, with the deep contentment of work nearly finished, its warm glow steady as a heartbeat that had learned to trust the hands holding it safe. Jerry moved through their morning ritual with the unhurried grace of someone whose body had begun requesting patience as its preferred language, each gesture carrying the accumulated wisdom of years spent listening to growing things. Ezra found himself anticipating needs before they were spoken, adjusting, cushions preparing tea that tasted of chamomile and accumulated mornings, offering his arm when the portal's threshold required negotiating. "Let's visit both gardens today," Jerry said softly, his voice carrying the particular hope of someone preparing to witness the completion of something beautiful. "See how they're learning to be themselves." The original courtyard felt transformed, not abandoned, but evolved into something gentler, a space that had learned to hold memory rather than demand presence. Where tomatoes had once climbed toward summer sun, morning light painted empty trellises that hummed with the accumulated whispers of countless conversations between gardener and growing things. The soil itself seemed to exhale gratitude, releasing the patient breath of earth that had given everything it could. Through the portal, their transplanted sanctuary thrived in the twilight valley's perpetual dusk. Mrs. Chen knelt among roses that had learned to catch starlight in their petals, whispering gratitude to blooms that glowed with the soft luminescence of flowers, carrying her grandmother's songs across impossible distances. The elderly gentleman had found his perfect bench, positioned where valley breezes carried the scent of herbs that released their fragrance like gifts offered freely. Noor arrived with his cousin Eleanor, both carrying small pots of succulents grown on apartment windowsills. "We brought something to plant," Elena said shyly, her voice carrying the particular hope of someone testing whether gardens might have room for newcomers. "There's always space for growing things that come with love," Jerry replied, guiding them toward soil that had been waiting for exactly this combination of courage and accumulated tenderness. As afternoon painted both realities in gentle watercolors, something extraordinary began happening in their threshold room. Maya arrived early to prepare tea, David opened the visitor ledger to a fresh page, and together they lit a small lantern in the window, not planned but felt, the natural evolution of a space that had learned to hold more than its original purpose. By evening, the light had found its first visitor, a figure who paused at their threshold, translucent at the edges, carrying the wary grace of someone far from home. Jerry lifted a cup without fuss, chamomile with honey, and set it down as if he'd been expecting exactly this kind of guest. "Sit," he said gently, the syllable a blanket. "You can be here without explaining." The traveler's outline steadied, and Ezra watched his device translate what the heart already knew. Safety was measurable. Comfort had its own elegant mathematics. Before dawn, the figure disappeared, but not before writing in their ledger with a hand that left glimmers where ink should have been, "Thank you for letting me be somebody for a while." 5 days remained, but the countdown had transformed completely. Not time running out, but time enough to discover what grew when love learned it could flourish across any distance, tended by hearts brave enough to choose connection over conquest, presence over the cold comfort of being brilliant alone. In his pocket, Ezra carried a blank card, its edges cool against his palm, waiting for words that would bridge the space between the boy who had once woken with numbers written on his hand and the man who had learned that the most elegant equations often began with someone asking whether you'd eaten today. The blank card in Ezra's pocket had been patient all morning, a cool weight against his palm as the 4th day unfolded with the gentle inevitability of completion approaching. Their threshold room hummed with the quiet satisfaction of work nearly finished, the carrying seed resting on the windowsill with the deep contentment of purpose fulfilled, its warm glow steady as a heartbeat that had learned to trust. Jerry sat, surrounded by accumulated correspondence, thank you notes written in careful cursive by neighbors who had learned that growing things responded to attention given freely. "Look at this," he said softly, holding up a card decorated with a child's drawing of roses. "Mrs. Patel's daughter. She writes that the garden taught her flowers have names worth learning, that patience smells like rosemary." The carrying seed pulsed with recognition, and Ezra felt something profound in his readings. Gratitude so deep it registered as gravity, the particular pull that draws hearts toward places where they have been consistently welcomed. As afternoon light painted both realities in watercolors of possibility, he pulled the blank card from his pocket, with hands that trembled slightly, not from dimensional instability, but from words that had been gathering like dew on patient leaves. "I want to write something," he said quietly, the decision arriving with certainty. For the boy who woke with numbers on his palm, for anyone who thinks brilliance means being alone. Jerry's smile carried the warmth of someone who had been waiting for this moment with the patient attention he gave to seedlings preparing to bloom. "What does your heart want to tell him?" Ezra looked around their sanctuary, at the window that held 2 worlds without strain, at the kettle that sang welcome to interdimensional refugees, at chairs where conversations had learned to curve like embrace. In letters that looked more like growing things than geometric precision, he wrote, "Dear, brilliant, lonely child, the numbers that wake you are not burdens but invitations. The universe chose you to build bridges between impossible things, but the most elegant equations will always require 2 variables, your magnificent mind and someone who asks whether thinking hurts too much. Find the person who makes extra sandwiches. Accept the blanket that smells like lavender. Learn that tears don't erase what you know, they make room for what you've been keeping out. When you meet the man who talks to tomatoes like old friends, Listen when he says someone should stay for the harvest. There is a place for you at the table. The strongest solutions grow from soil blessed by accumulated tenderness, tended by hearts brave enough to choose connection over conquest. You are already enough. He folded the card and placed it in their visitor ledger, where it settled between testimonies of gratitude, like a seed finding proper depth in fertile soil. The room seemed to exhale, and for a moment the paper lifted in a small current that smelled of basil and rain. "Did you write what needed writing?" Jerry asked, his voice soft with certainty. "I did," Ezra answered, watching the twilight valley glow through their window, where transplanted roots had learned to breathe in silver moss that held starlight. "It knows where to go." 3 days remained, but the countdown no longer carried urgency, only the gentle anticipation of harvest approaching, of discovering what bloomed when patience and attention were given time to take root in soil that had been waiting all along to be found by exactly this combination of courage and accumulated tenderness. The final morning arrived painted in the soft gold of recognition, light that had learned to hold both completion and beginning in the same gentle embrace. Ezra woke to find Jerry already dressed, moving through their threshold room with the unhurried grace of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding that the most important work happened in the spaces between heartbeats, in the patient mathematics of choosing presence over efficiency. "Coffee first," Jerry said, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of someone whose roots had found their proper depth. "Then we visit everyone, make sure they know they're home." The Twilight Valley welcomed them with the soft contentment of soil that had learned to hold accumulated tenderness. Mrs. Chen knelt among roses that glowed with starlight caught in petals, her whispered gratitude weaving through air thick with the fragrance of flowers that had traveled impossible distances without losing their capacity for wonder. The elderly gentleman had found his perfect rhythm on a bench, positioned where valley breezes carried the scent of herbs, releasing their memories like gifts offered freely. As afternoon painted both realities in watercolors of possibility, they returned to the original courtyard one final time. The developer's fence stood like a gentle boundary rather than a harsh ending, and Ezra knelt to press his palm against earth that had given everything it could. "Thank you," he whispered, not to machinery or mathematics, but to the small patch of world that had taught him what rescue really meant. Together, they left a jar of marigold seeds on the fence post with a note in Jerry's careful handwriting. "If you need a beginning, take a few. Plant them where you plan to stay." The breeze lifted the paper like a blessing, and somewhere a pigeon called like benediction. Back in their threshold sanctuary, the carrying seed found its final rest on the windowsill, settling into silver moss, with the deep exhale of work completed with love. Its glow began to spread through root systems, teaching the entire valley how to hold the patient architecture of belonging. Maya and David gathered their notebooks, now journals that curved equations like embrace, preparing for journeys that would carry these lessons to new soil. "What grows next?" Ezra asked, watching evening stars appear in both realities. Jerry's smile was warm as late sunshine. "We tend what we've planted. We help other gardens find their way to safety when they need it. We discover what blooms when love learns it doesn't have to choose between brilliance and belonging." In the months that followed, Ezra would publish his paper on emotional quantum entanglement, work that baffled academics, but found quiet audience among those who understood that the universe's most profound secrets were often hidden in simple acts of choosing to care. His laboratory became a place where young researchers were first offered warm drinks and quiet space to simply be, before any equations were discussed. Through their window, the transplanted community moved with the comfortable rhythm of people who had learned that the most elegant solutions grew from soil blessed by accumulated moments of choosing connection over conquest. The singing flower's melody wove through evening air like a gentle benediction, reminding them that some frequencies could only be preserved by communities willing to hold them in chorus, and somewhere, in a reality where friendship transcends dimensions, two souls continue sharing sandwiches and marveling at the strange, beautiful mathematics of caring for each other. The universe is vast, but it's also small enough to hold in the space between two people who choose, again and again, to stay. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.